June 1941. At dawn, the horizon over the Soviet frontier glowed with fire. Hundreds of German panzers rolled east, their commanders certain the campaign would last only weeks. Behind them marched the most experienced army in the world, veterans of Poland, France, and the Balkans. Their confidence was absolute. They called this invasion Barbarossa. To them it was not a question of if Germany would win, but how fast. Yet within days that certainty began to crack. Cannon blast, metallic clang sound of ricochet. In the fields outside Minsk, German anti-tank crews fired round after round at a shape none of them had seen before. Shells, instead of piercing armor, screamed harmlessly away into the air. Through the smoke lumbered a squat, angular giant, gun turning silently toward them. The startled commander shouted, "That's impossible!" Then the creature fired back. The explosion buried their gun, and with it, the illusion of easy victory. Germany had just met the T-34. The tank's name was simple, its impact anything but. The T-34 would force the German army to redesign its entire armored doctrine, rewriting what it meant to wage mechanized war. Even today, historians call it one of the most influential machines ever built. To understand why the Germans couldn't stop it, we have to rewind to the months before the invasion, when arrogance blinded an empire to what was coming. In 1941, the Wehrmacht believed its Panzer III and IV series represented perfection, speed, precision, and discipline, the embodiment of blitzkrieg. Soviet equipment, by contrast, was assumed obsolete, thin-skinned, slow, and mass-produced by peasants. And for a while the Germans were right. The first days of Barbarossa looked unstoppable. Swarming tanks cutting through border divisions, columns of prisoners stretching for miles. Then reconnaissance pilots began reporting strange shapes moving out of the forest machines, far larger than anything Germans expected to see. The reports sounded exaggerated. Sloped armor, wide tracks, a 76mm gun. Officers in Berlin dismissed them as confusion in the fog of war until the first wrecked Panzer III arrived in a repair depot with clean holes burned straight through its front plate. The T-34 wasn't just another tank, it was a new idea of what a tank could be. Compact yet deadly, cheap yet ingenious. The Germans out-trained their enemies, but the Soviets had quietly out-engineered them. A slanted hull that deflected shells, suspension that conquered mud, and armor thick enough to shrug off the most common German guns of 1941. At distances where German shells bounced, the T-34 could destroy. The result was panic, then respect. German intelligence circulars noted, unless immediate countermeasures are taken, all panzer divisions will suffer heavy losses. But countermeasures took time, and time was the one thing Germany no longer had. Through that summer, as heat turned to autumn dust, the myth of the invincible Wehrmacht began to erode. What began as invasion was becoming survival. For the first time, German soldiers whispered a thought unimaginable only weeks earlier, that their enemy might be stronger than their pride allowed them to believe. And the symbol of that realization rumbled on wide steel tracks, the T-34. When the German columns crossed into the Soviet Union, they believed every tank they faced would be an easy kill. For 2 years they had fought opponents whose machines were old and brittle, whose tactics were predictable, whose armor cracked after a few rounds from the 37mm guns mounted on the standard Panzer. Against Poland, France, Yugoslavia, and Greece, the pattern had been the same. Speed, surprise, and fire discipline overwhelmed defenses before the enemy even understood what was happening. On paper, the Soviet Union looked no different. In 1941, German analysts still described the most Red Army tanks as primitive tractors. What they met in the fields of Belarus was something else entirely. At first, only rumors traveled through the command channels. Some regiments reported tanks that their shells could not penetrate. Others spoke of silhouettes that looked unfamiliar, like low black boulders moving through the smoke. German anti-tank teams were skeptical until they saw the evidence themselves. Crews manning the standard 37mm pack guns would unload armor-piercing rounds at close range and watch them spark off without effect. The glowing casings clattered uselessly to the ground while the Soviet tank kept advancing. Panic quickly replaced the casual arrogance that had defined the first weeks of the campaign. Officers asked for reinforcements, for heavier guns, for air cover, for anything that could stop these new monsters. Captured soldiers finally provided details. The machine was designated T-34. It weighed just over 30 tons, carried a 76mm gun, and sat on wide tracks that allowed it to cross the swampy ground where German armor bogged down. More importantly, its armor was slanted, a design that effectively thickened its protection and deflected incoming shells. No German tank had such a feature. It looked simple, but it turned out to be revolutionary. Sloped armor meant that the same sheet of steel could resist up to twice as much impact without adding weight. The T-34 combined survivability with mobility, and that equation changed everything. German soldiers who faced it for the first time later described their disbelief. They saw enemy tanks take direct hits, vanish in smoke, and then re-emerge still moving. Machine gun fire glanced off like rain. Even the air crews engaging them found that their usual dive bombing runs did little unless the bomb landed squarely on the hull. When reports reached higher headquarters, many were ignored. Commanders assumed their men were exaggerating, or that the encounters involved the heavier but rarer Soviet KV series. It took destroyed divisions to convince the leadership that something extraordinary was happening on the battlefield. What confused the Germans even more was how many of these new tanks began to appear. They believed the Soviet industry too primitive to produce such machines in quantity. In truth, factories behind the Urals were already working around the clock, using simplified blueprints and crude but effective production lines. Every month, hundreds of T-34s poured from assembly halls. The Germans, who valued precision above speed, could not match that output. They built better optics and tighter machining, but their philosophy favored quality over numbers. The Soviets, forced by the scale of invasion, favored the opposite. As the summer advanced, the evidence became undeniable. German gun crews abandoned their short-barreled cannons and improvised heavier weapons by mounting captured Soviet guns on their own chassis. Field commanders begged for the new 88mm anti-aircraft pieces to be reassigned to groundwork because it was the only gun capable of breaking a T-34 frontally. It was an act of improvisation that saved entire units, but it also signaled the end of Germany's belief in invincibility. Across the Eastern Front, morale eroded with each encounter. Soldiers began calling the new tanks ghosts because they seemed to survive everything. The only advantages left to the Germans were training, communication, and maneuver. They could still outthink a Soviet crew, but they could no longer rely on superior machines. For an army built on the promise of technological dominance, that realization cut deep. By late summer, even successful engagements came at terrible cost. The T-34's wide tracks turned mud into an ally, while German panzers sank into ruts and waited for recovery crews under fire. The weather that had once slowed Napoleon now slowed Hitler's army. Every kilometer forward required disproportionate effort. What had started as a lightning strike was grinding into attrition. The presence of the T-34 forced a change of mindset. Officers who had studied tank tactics at German academies began sketching new armor profiles on scraps of paper, trying to copy the sloped silhouette that had stunned them in the field. Engineers back home received urgent telegrams demanding designs that could face these Soviet innovations. They would eventually answer with the Panther and Tiger series. But those tanks were still dreams in blueprint form. In the summer and autumn of 1941, the soldiers at the front had to survive with what they already had. And for many, that was not enough. The German engineers who first examined a captured T-34 in the autumn of 1941 approached it with a mixture of frustration and admiration. The hull was crude by their standards: rough welds, unpolished seams, but what they saw beneath the surface astonished them. It was not elegance that made the T-34 powerful. It was logic, born from necessity. Every feature solved a real problem that armies on the Eastern Front faced: mud, snow, mechanical wear, and the brutal distances of Russia. The most striking element was the armor. Instead of thick vertical slabs like on the Panzer III or IV, the Soviet designers had tilted every main plate at sharp angles. What looked like a design shortcut was in fact geometry at work. When a projectile struck a slanted surface, it had to travel through more metal and often deflected entirely. German tests showed that a 45mm plate at that angle could resist rounds that normally penetrated 80mm of flat steel. The discovery was infuriating. The Soviets had achieved near invulnerability while keeping weight low enough for mass production. Then came the gun. The 76.2mm main cannon delivered much heavier impact than anything a standard German tank carried that year. It outranged the Panzer III and could destroy one long before the Germans were close enough to respond. The wide turret ring let Soviet crews traverse the weapon quickly, while the simple optical sights made aiming easy even for scarcely trained conscripts. Precision might have been inferior, but sheer hitting power compensated for every flaw. The engines suited the environment perfectly. Instead of the petrol motors used by most nations, the T-34 relied on a compact diesel V12, less likely to ignite when struck and better suited for long marches. German officers, accustomed to carefully maintained workshops, were stunned to find an engine that ran even when full of dust and ice. It consumed cheaper fuel, and its torque let the heavy tracks grind through terrain that turned other vehicles into stationary targets. The suspension system was equally decisive. It used Christie-style coil springs, giving long wheel travel that absorbed shocks and allowed higher speed across open fields. On the steppe, where roads were rare and rainfall turned the ground to swamps, this advantage meant freedom. The Germans often had to stay on roads, predictable routes, where Soviet ambushes could wait. The T-34 could appear from any direction, over ground no one imagined a tank could cross. Even the details impressed: the enormous road wheels that simplified maintenance, the wide tracks that spread weight so lightly a T-34 could roll over soil that collapsed under a Panzer. The entire design was evolutionary genius, each decision small, but together transforming war on land. Soviet engineers had stripped away refinement in favor of survivability, ease of repair, and output. The result was not the perfect tank, but the perfect wartime tank. For German commanders reading field reports, the numbers told the same story. In every major engagement of 1941, tank losses showed the imbalance. One T-34 might fall, but it could take several German vehicles with it. The only way to regain parity was to deploy the heavy 88mm guns or use dive bombers from the air tactics that stretched logistics and fuel supply. The army that had prided itself on independence of movement was now dependent on other branches to kill tanks. Berlin's Ordnance Department ordered immediate studies of how to respond. Engineers from companies that built the Panzer III gathered around confiscated T-34s, measuring armor slopes and track width, sketching the simplified gearbox, copying the long-barreled gun. These examinations would later inspire the design of the Panther, a heavier, more complicated machine meant to match the Soviet rival. But in 1941, there was no time to develop or build such replacements. The invasion was bogged down, winter approached, and the troops at the front were fighting with weapons no longer adequate for the enemy they faced. What frustrated the Germans even more was how straightforward the T-34 seemed. It was not a miracle of hidden technology, merely a collection of sensible ideas executed with ruthless practicality. The Germans prized craftsmanship that required careful machining. The Soviets preferred parts that could be stamped, welded, and replaced by unskilled hands. The result was numbers that outweighed sophistication. Every battle made the lesson clearer. Outside Moscow, in fields glazed with frost, German tanks tried to maneuver around Soviet lines but were halted by mud and snow. T-34s advanced without pause. Mechanics replaced entire track assemblies in minutes using hammers and crowbars. Crews refueled from drums under sleet and kept moving. From the air, it looked as though the German offensive had hit an invisible wall, and the Soviet army now pressed back across its own haunted ground. By early 1942, many German officers privately admitted respect for the Soviet design. Captured manuals were translated, and prototypes were built that copied its principles. It was a reluctant homage born from defeat. They understood that the T-34 represented a kind of perfection they could not duplicate quickly, a weapon that married industrial simplicity with battlefield effectiveness. For a nation addicted to complexity, that lesson was hard to accept. The T-34 was not flawless. Its optics were poor, its crew space cramped, radio scarce, but those imperfections did not matter. Thousands of them rolled from railway cars every month, each one carrying the weight of brutal logic. It needed only to be good enough to win. While German engineers pursued the ideal tank, the Soviets fielded an army of them. The equilibrium of the Eastern Front shifted permanently the moment that first T-34 survived the hail of German fire. From then onward, the war became a contest of production rather than tactics. For the soldiers who faced it, every encounter was the same revelation. The enemy's tank seemed to come from another future, and the future, it turned out, belonged to whoever could build more machines like this one. The shock of the T-34 did not fade with the snows of 1941. Inside the German high command, it became an obsession. Panic reports from the front were collected in thick folders labeled "Find Panzer," new enemy tank. Engineers, officers, and industrialists were summoned to emergency meetings. Their assignment was simple in words and impossible in practice: design a tank that could destroy the T-34 at range and survive its gunfire in return. In the winter of 1942, the blueprints began to emerge. The first was the Panther. Its designers studied every captured T-34 and copied its most obvious strength, the sloped armor. The Panther's hull was a geometric echo of the Soviet machine, but larger, heavier, more engineered in every detail. It mounted a 75mm long-barrel gun that could pierce a T-34 frontally from well over a kilometer away. The second project was even bigger: the Tiger, a 45-ton giant carrying the famous 88mm cannon, the same weapon that had terrified Allied pilots. On paper, both tanks looked unstoppable, but on battlefields, perfection dragged chains. The Panther and Tiger were brilliant individual machines trapped inside a faltering system. Their armor was thick, but so was their burden-complex gearboxes, delicate suspensions, and engines that demanded precision fuel and constant maintenance. A Panther required nearly twice the production time of a T-34 and consumed far more resources. Every one that rolled from a German factory meant 2 T-34s left Soviet plants. And when those sophisticated machines reached the front, mud, cold, and shortage of spares reduced their promise. German crews quickly learned that engineering excellence was no substitute for numbers. In the great tank battles of 1943, most famously at Kursk, the new designs appeared in strength for the first time. The open plains thundered with thousands of engines. Shells streaked across smoke-filled skies. The powerful Tigers crushed everything directly in front of them, but they were few, and Soviet tactics had evolved. Swarms of T-34s absorbed losses the way the steppe absorbed rain. They encircled, flanked, and flowed around the heavier German armor. When the dust settled, the casualty tables told the deeper truth. The Soviet Union could replace its dead metal by the next month. Germany could not. Behind the lines, the same contrast ruined production goals. Soviet factories used welding torches and conveyor belts, cutting corners mercilessly. German industry insisted on tolerances measured in fractions of a millimeter, on polished fittings and meticulous checks that reflected pride but wasted time. Berlin's system built masterpieces for museums. Moscow's built weapons for war. As months turned into years, the imbalance widened. The Panther became a symbol of technical beauty, but logistical despair. Crews revere its gun, yet cursed its fragility. The Tiger inspired awe, but it drank fuel at a rate no retreating army could afford. Even when they won duels, they lost the campaign. The Wehrmacht's armored spearhead was now a collection of precious antiques fighting against an avalanche of simplicity. On the Soviet side, improvement never ceased. The T-34/85 model, with a larger turret and heavier gun, erased the Panther's range advantage. Within a year of its debut, the battlefield equilibrium returned, and still, the numerical flood grew. By 1944, 2,000 or 3,000 Soviet tanks rolled across front lines in a single operation. The once invincible German armor, trapped by its own brilliance, simply drowned under quantity. This contrast between form and function summed up the story of the Eastern Front. German ingenuity built machines of exquisite power. The Soviets built machines the world could not destroy fast enough. The Tiger and Panther were triumphs of design and failures of strategy. They served their crews with honor, but they arrived too late, and in numbers too small to bend history. By 1945, supplies of fuel and parts had collapsed. Many of the remaining tanks were abandoned or blown up by their own crews to keep them from capture. The fields that once echoed with the clatter of treads fell silent, replaced by the relentless advance of the same silhouette that had haunted the Germans since 1941, the T-34. It was more than a tank now. It was a symbol of endurance over perfection, of practicality over pride. It proved that the empire which could adapt faster, build faster, and learn faster would rule the battlefield. In that lesson lay the beginning of Germany's defeat and the defining principle of modern warfare. The soldiers who faced the T-34 never forgot its presence. The whistle of its engine in the snow, the slant of its armor gleaming in dawn light, the feeling that history itself was moving toward them on steel tracks.